Please, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about dendrites, specifically as a biologically inspired approach to overcome catastrophic forgetting. And it relates to what we were talking about which biological details are important to implement in artificial systems to help given a specific set of tasks. So let's go back to point neurons, right? They compute linear weighted sum of inputs followed by an unlinearity. Pretty standard. Historically, they're biologically inspired, although they are very far from a biological neuron. There are abstractions that are built to answer a specific question. And from a fit to a neuroscience data point of view, it's pretty bad models, but it's definitely very useful, especially in artificial neural networks, where it's used a lot, especially for its computational efficiency. But this neuron abstraction, and coupled with the way we train DeepNet backprop, right? It's shown cases where those networks fail miserably, and that's where continual learning and catastrophic forgetting problems come in. So the question that I'm asking here is which details matter and which don't in those abstractions. So there's definitely a relevance of complexity, and here I'm just going to point to a couple of studies where complexity is relevant for a better performance. The first one is basically showing that in dendrite, in a model neuron, will allow, with a specific architecture, for spiking neural networks to learn an error propagation, right? The second one shows that neural heterogeneity promotes robust learning, and it does help with task performance when your substrate is very heterogeneous in its property. The third one basically shows that, once again, heterogeneous population of neurons, in that case, different types of neurons, leads to a more efficient and also more robust learning, especially in that case towards correlated noise. Sorry. The last study implemented dendrites as a sequence of thresholded linear units, and then manipulated that architecture to see how it affects a specific ML task. And they showed that that model performance is on par with more complex, fully connected neural networks. Sorry. So I'm going to go back to what are dendrites in biology. They are major element of biological neurons. They are projections from the cell soma into the surrounding environment. They make up most of the substrate of connections between cells. And overall, as you can see here, they have extremely diverse morphologies. And in biology, usually there's a link between structure and function. So if we have very different structure, what would be the function of all of those different structures, right? So there's a study that was published recently that was very interesting, since it put in doubt the conceptual usefulness of dendrites, because it showed that you can approximate the input-output function of pyramidal neurons. It doesn't matter what type of neuron, but a biological neuron using a 7-layer ANN composed of point neurons. And that is extremely interesting. The caveat to this is that it's at a specific point in time, and no matter how deep your ANN is, it will always be subject to catastrophic forgetting. So the hypothesis from there is that, and from a lot of work on dendrites, is that dendritic units, if you model dendrites, can help minimize catastrophic forgetting in continual learning while still maintaining a low compute overhead. That's the idea. So what are those dendritic properties, right? What do dendrites do? Well, it's not easy to answer, because biology can be pretty hard to untangle. But what we know is that they are coincidence detectors. They will code differing information content depending on the dendrite branch that we are on, and which leads to the potential emergence of functional subdomains. So let's take this for a second. If we stimulate here the dendrite at that red point, we see that at the soma, that's recorded in green here, we have no activity. If we stimulate the blue one, same thing. But if we stimulate both at the same time, then at the soma, we have a response of the neuron. If we go at a higher level, a current experience with its shape, motion, and color will be encoded as context and feature in different part of the dendritic arbor of a neuron. And then at the same time, you have priors or memories of relevant to that current experience that are going to be encoded on other branches, dendritic branches. And all of that makes a cohesive overview of what the dendrite encode at any time and point. And that also leads to, on the right here, functional subdomains of specific computational substructures of dendrites, right? Second property of dendrites is that they are able to do linear and nonlinear computation. So a neuron in biology contains both active and passive dendrites. The passive dendrites will only show a linear and a sublinear input summation of all of its inputs at different times. But active dendrites, they're particular because they can show supralinear output. So if you here stimulate two different dendrites and you look at the soma, if you do one stimulation of one electrode, you can see a specific trace. If you stimulate the other, you see a specific trace. The sum would be that big trace. And what you actually get is a nonlinear transformation here of both inputs at the same time. And that's for spatial summation. You also have linear temporal summation. Sorry. When the inputs come relatively close in time, you can have that nonlinearity, but that's not the case when inputs are more distant in time. So the same thing in different words is when you have within branches stimulation, you can see here nonlinearity where it's not the case when you stimulate two different branches. So the temporal and also physical location of the stimulus that is incoming into a neuron is very important to direct the response of that neuron to those inputs. A third property is the dendritic plateau potential. And what that means is, depending upon that dendrite components, biological components, it's going to respond to a stimulus in different waveform. And the point of this is that it can integrate information over more or less time. And that's very relevant for when you want to integrate things over 1 or 2 milliseconds versus 20 or 30, for example, or more. And the last thing I'm going to talk about on dendrite property is their differences in morphology has a direct impact in the EPSP, which is basically the input strength of that connection. So if you vary the diameter, if you vary the location, if you vary the number of branch points of that dendrite, all of that has an impact on the strength of the input. Also, if you vary the composition, so ion channels, for example, of that dendrite, you will not necessarily have the same output. And all of these combinations are exploding and make a lot of different neurons with extremely different properties. So I'm gonna show you a few studies that are relevant, not necessarily for continual learning, but where these property and this complexity shows that it helps to encode things better or stronger or are relevant in the last study to continual learning specifically. So that study, basically, I'm not going to go into details, that would be too long, but what the main takeaway is that when you have nonlinear dendrites, it helps store memories using fewer resources than if you would not have those nonlinearities. And the second point is that the linked memory, when you learn, for example, two different things in different point of time, if you learn those very close one to another, then they are going to be stored on overlapping dendrites. The second study I mentioned briefly before is a model of dendrite as a sequence of threshold linear units. And you can see here at the bottom, basically you take a dendrite architecture and you try to model it with repeated inputs. And you can then iterate on that model depending upon and make vary like the number of K-trees, the number of branching points, all of that. And what's been shown is that it's able to solve standard ML tasks in non-continual learning scenarios on par with a fully connected neural network. And once again, interestingly, those networks benefit from having the same inputs onto several different branches of the dendritic tree. And so that demonstrates the importance of synaptic input repetition. And basically, those models are important because they can then inform biology of what they can look at. The last study I'm going to talk about right now is actually two studies where it's an implementation of dendritic unit in an MLP and tested in both permuted MNIST and reinforcement learning task. And basically, there's a context that is informed into standard unit through dendritic branching, and that allows for specific gating of information, which then activates some specific subnetworks in the MLP, which is gated by those dendritic inputs. And this network performs better than a 3-layer or even a 10-layer MLP without those dendrites. And what's very interesting is that the dendrites in that experiment become very specialized in a very few tasks after training, which so this contradicts the previous hypothesis that I mentioned that a dendritic neuron would be equivalent to a multi-layer network, because first of all, those multi-layer networks are capable of performing well in those settings of continual learning due to catastrophic forgetting, and that's the case regardless of network depth. And here we can see the RL environment training. So it takes a little bit longer for the dendrite network to get on par with a typical MLP, but then it gets even better than that. So to conclude, the dendrite's computational role is far from solved, whether we're talking about biology or artificial networks. Neuroscience can inform model designs, which in turn can also inform back neuroscience, and that's a very neat loop. Depending upon the task, adding dendrites could increase the computational overhead without necessarily any benefits. For example, in non-continual learning scenarios, there might be very few, if any, benefits to adding dendrites. I'm thinking a very simple task that we can perform well today. Adding dendrites would only add some computational cost, and that's about it. But in continual learning settings or in more complex tasks, it's possible that dendrites could be a very powerful mechanisms to design networks that are more robust to catastrophic forgetting. That's one point, but the other point is it could be more than that. There's still a lot of open-ended questions. First of all, the computational overhead of dendrite is worth the cost in every scenario. That's probably not the case. which are the scenarios where dendrites would help the most perform a specific task? What are dendrite mechanisms that would enhance classical deep net the most? That's also an open question, and a lot more. So thank you very much. And if you have questions, please ask. And here's a list of references if you are interested.
Great presentation. Thanks, Jeremy. I don't know if there are any questions from the attendees.